ladies and gentlemen, Panzer here, and welcome to the Panzer Game Awards of 2016. I don't even know. Yesterday you guys saw the best games of 2016, and it has been just a fantastic year for gaming with some of the best games this year. Yes, 2016 has been a bit of a roller coaster of emotions, I guess, but yeah, at least for gaming anyway, it's been really good. So believe me when I say that the worst games of 2016 aren't actually that bad. It was a struggle to put games on this list simply because either I hadn't played them, you know, if they were worse than this, I hadn't played them, or simply because, well, they're not really that bad at all. So coming up with 5 worst games was difficult, and I mean really difficult. So with the exception of a couple of games on this list, most of these games would still be alright in any other year of gaming. If you put this list in 2012 all the way to 2015, you would find worse games of the year. Undoubtedly, without a doubt, you would find worse games, with a couple of exceptions. So what could possibly be on this list then, if everything has been so good? Well, this list is very short, so if you haven't seen the best games of 2016, click the link in the description or in the comments or on the annotations, depending on where the hell I put it. Click that to go and see that, because the list was much longer. This list contains 6 games, meaning there is only one honorable mention in this list, and even that isn't particularly bad. So, of course, the criteria for games to be on the best and worst list are as follows. They have to be games released in 2016. That's pretty self-explanatory. But they also have to be games that I personally have played. They might not be something I've played on the channel, either being my Twitch channel or YouTube. They just have to be games that I have personally played and can actually talk about how it relates to me. Because after all, this is my own personal list. And of course, if you have worse games, do feel free to put them down in the comments below. I do want to see what is your top and bottom 5 of 2016. And of course, if you want to let me know why you've picked games like that, do feel free to put it down there in the comments as well. So, 2016's worst games. Now, the honorable mention here, and this is just one game, and I know this is going to be very divisive, so if you are a fan of this game, please remember that I do not absolutely hate this game. It is just probably not the best showing for me personally in this year. But that game, the honorable mention for the worst games of 2016, is Battlefield 1. Yeah, okay, so this is probably going to get a lot of people raging in the comments already. If you are about to, hold on a minute, because yes, this game actually isn't that bad. It's just, it wasn't what I was looking for. After having played Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4, I was expecting that the new setting of Battlefield 1 would change the game up more than it did, but unfortunately, it really didn't do as much for me as I thought it would. I didn't like the vehicle spawning system. I preferred vehicles to be on the ground that you could actually go into. I didn't like the spawning system that seemed to be lifted from Battlefront, actually. Granted, it's not a power-up, but it's still like you spawn in it from the beginning. Planes aren't really like take off and land, if you will. They just spawn in thin air. But the point is, it didn't deliver on the experience that I was looking for. The weapons themselves, while authentic and seem to be sort of a varied mixture, especially compared to what we had in Battlefield 3 and 4, they are definitely very different and very interesting mechanically. But overall, as I was playing the game anyway, I didn't feel like I would be out of place if this was World War II instead of World War I. If you put the number of SMGs in there and LMGs, it would have felt the same, and that's something that I think was a little bit disappointing. On top of that, the pre-order bonuses, if I remember correctly, included the Hellfighter kit, which included the trench shotgun. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it doesn't unlock until much later, and there are a couple of maps which it excels on, so you did actually get a slight boost in power above other people, which I didn't find to be particularly fair. But even without that, the game itself, if I just look at the single-player component, I liked the different sort of enclosed war stories, that it wasn't a full-length campaign. I liked that they were like short little campaigns that you could play. That was good. But the writing in the campaigns did let me down a little bit. I didn't really find them to be all that enjoyable, mainly because it did still have that open world feel that Battlefield has, in that you can take any path really through the terrain you want to go to. It's good, but it does lead to some unintentional effects which really break the game immersion. And the game quite lost me at the point where I was playing as a pigeon. So those things aside really just kind of ruined the experience for me. Compared to other Battlefield games, I still feel that the multiplayer component was overall just better in those compared to Battlefield 1. It was a good attempt, an interesting setting, but overall the game seemed to play a little bit too on the safe side for my liking, and ultimately I wanted something more from that. It just didn't do what I wanted it to. So, not a bad game, and definitely nothing wrong if you're enjoying it. I am very happy for you if you did enjoy it, but it just wasn't really for me. So, with that being on the honorable mention list, I think that pretty much sets the tone for what could be the worst games of 2016, really. Because, ultimately, they're all not very bad games. So, what could be on this list then? Well, let's start with number 5. Shadow Warrior 2. Now, Shadow Warrior is an interesting one, because the original Shadow Warrior, at least from this particular series of Shadow Warrior, is a reboot. It's a reboot of a game that was around a lot earlier, and it was kind of in the same vein as the sort of Duke Nukem, Doom type shooters, a lot of the old Wolfenstein 3D and so forth. It was along those same sort of lines, and it had the, I guess, Duke Nukem style to it of humor. It was a bit sort of corny, cheesy, and cliched, and to a certain degree quite offensive to many people. I didn't really find it that bad, honestly. The gameplay itself is very, very good. The sword mechanics, in fact, the host of melee weapons in Shadow Warrior 2 is fantastic. The weapon selection is absolutely great. The number of reload animations and just how seriously it doesn't take itself was great. The thing that let it down the most was the loot system. Now, the loot system is very Borderlands-y in that you get a lot of weapon drops, you get a lot of little upgrades, and all of them don't really seem to do a hell of a lot. Now, you could argue that, oh no, it's supposed to be like that, so you can play the way you want, but when the upgrades are very marginal, I would rather not have to sort through my inventory and, you know, get rid of the upgrades I don't want, and to just do inventory management in between fights. The game is so fast-paced and so quick that having something that slows it down like that is kind of akin to sliding down a slope at 200 miles an hour and then suddenly hitting a brick wall. It kills the gameplay momentum entirely when you have to do it, and I thought that is what really let it down. It's cool that they had different bosses and different enemies. I mean, the enemy variety is fantastic. You had different enemies with all sorts of different moves and styles, and bosses that had interesting combos, and they also had resistances and weaknesses and all that. I thought that was good. The only thing is really just that entire inventory management and loot system just let it down so much. It's still well worth picking up and trying, for sure, but unless you really enjoy managing that inventory, it's going to really just slow you down and frustrate you, as it did with me. It's one of the reasons I haven't gone back to playing it. Number 4, Pokemon Go, and probably the only mobile game on this list, and frankly, I think it's the only one that really deserves to be on here. I am a fan of Pokemon. I actually really did enjoy all the Pokemon games. I didn't own a Game Boy, so I had to play them all on emulators, but, you know, as much as possible, I did try to do things like buy the trading cards and all that, because I did want to put money towards a franchise that I enjoyed, but, you know, I didn't really have access to a lot of these things. But either way, Pokemon Blue was the game that I first started playing with Pokemon, and then I went on to Pokemon Yellow. I played all sorts of different versions, and I still found them really enjoyable. I was never really a fan of the sort of party and turn-based system, but that was a game that really kind of introduced me to it and kind of made me enjoy it to a certain degree. So, Pokemon was definitely one of my favorite franchises, but Pokemon Go itself just feels like if you were to make a walking game out of Farmville, that's what it was. Hatching eggs requires walking, and while I'm not against walking per se, it just didn't add that much to it. I often found myself just opening it when I was walking my dog, and that's about it. It was just sort of a time-wasting thing to do while doing something else. And frankly, I didn't get that much enjoyment out of it. Even catching certain Pokemon just didn't really feel special, especially since it was a case of just, well, time your throw and throw the ball at it until it, you know, subsides. And that was kind of it. So, not really the best example of a Pokemon game, I feel. And frankly, while I do get that a lot of people do enjoy it, it just really isn't a very good game. It's compelling because it's Pokemon, I guess, in the real world, but as a game on its own, if you detach it from Pokemon as a franchise, is still a bit meh. And that's the reason why it's on this list. Number 3. Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. Now, again, going with the theme that the games on this list aren't particularly bad per se, Infinite Warfare, at least from the multiplayer perspective, feels like a game confused. It doesn't know if it wants to still continue with Black Ops 3 or go back to the original way of Call of Duty Modern Warfare. It's kind of trapped in between, and as a result, it has a wall running mechanic that doesn't seem to really add that much to the gameplay other than just being there. It has weapons that feel relatively uninspired, with a couple of different exceptions of course. But overall, it just feels like more of the same, and more of the same isn't what people wanted, unfortunately. You compare that to Titanfall 2's movement system, and Infinite Warfare suddenly feels a bit let down. Now, the gameplay and the gunplay, at least, is still more or less similar to previous games, so it's not that far out of left field if you did enjoy Call of Duty's gameplay. But overall, I still found myself enjoying Black Ops 3 and even Advanced Warfare a lot more than I did with Infinite Warfare. Now, from the campaign perspective, they did have some interesting characters. I mean, Ethan as a character is fun. He is actually very well written. The campaign itself is pretty typical action movie, and there's a lot of, I guess, scientific inconsistencies for the sake of action, but that's okay and that's to be expected. After all, it is Call of Duty. It is a silly action movie campaign. But even so, it wasn't enough to bring it back. Now, the way they did the campaign, of course, it being a bit more like Mass Effect than the previous Call of Duty games where it was a linear campaign. In this one, you have the side missions and you can do the main missions in any order, and I liked that. I did actually enjoy that. But overall, it just isn't enough to justify the price tag, and when you look at the fact that the multiplayer component will inevitably have DLC and microtransactions, it just doesn't feel like a game that's worth the money at this stage. So unless you really wanted Modern Warfare Remastered, probably one to avoid. Number 2. The Technomancer. Now, this is a game that I did actually cover on the channel a while back, and while I did at that point say it was worth waiting for, I didn't really give it a glowing recommendation, because I didn't really find that the game was that big of a deal, really. It's set on Mars, and you are a part of the sort of electrical, I guess, cult. People who have control over machines and electricity. So you are all called Technomancers, and the story is a little bit meh. That's the way I can describe it. It falls flat on its face, it isn't particularly well written. The characters aren't memorable in any way, shape or form to me. And on top of that, the world itself, and this is the part that let me down the most, it's set on Mars at a time where humans have colonized it, if I remember correctly. But ultimately, the world was interesting enough that I wanted to know more about it, but I was let down by the fact that the story just kind of got in the way of all of that. You didn't really get a good insight onto what this world was about, and that just feels like a really big missed opportunity. As an RPG, the dialogue choices and options you have are fairly inconsequential, really. You do have some choices, of course, of what you can do, but ultimately it isn't really clear whether any of it actually matters. So overall, a game that was let down just by the writing of it all, and I think was fairly disappointing as a result. The combat system was just, it tried to be Arkham and didn't really know what made Arkham combat good. So overall just kind of a mishmash of different mechanics that didn't really feel coherent in any way. While it wasn't necessarily bad to play, it just didn't really do anything for me that I couldn't get out of better games like The Witcher or so on. So yeah, not a particularly fantastic game either way. So that is the number 2 on the list. What could be number 1 of this year? The worst game of this year. Worst games 2016, there are a lot of games that would come to mind, but I think this one shouldn't surprise anybody when I say that without a doubt the worst game of 2016 is No Man's Sky. Yeah, I don't think this really would surprise anybody, frankly. I did cover No Man's Sky on the channel, and even then I didn't enjoy it in any way, shape or form. And I'm referring mainly to the PC version of the game. I get that, yes, the PS4 version is subtly different, but the PC port is what really puts the final nail in the coffin for me for No Man's Sky. The game was built up on hype, promise, and fairly misleading answers to questions by Hello Games CEO Sean Murray. And frankly, even if you detach it from that, the game itself just has a whole lot of nothing in it. The language that the different alien races sort of speak is the closest they had to actually deepening the universe and the lore, but overall it just had the feeling of an ocean with the depth of a paddling pool. It was a very shallow game to me. The procedural generation of planets and animals, I think No Man's Sky could safely be said as one example of why procedural generation isn't used for a lot of games, and that's simply because either you end up with a lot of unintended effects, or you restrict it to the point where everything kind of looks the same. And unfortunately, No Man's Sky has reached that point where, while the planets might be different, but when you land on them, to me, it didn't really feel like it was. It also had one of the worst UIs I'd ever seen. It was clunky to operate. There are moments where in combat, especially in ship combat, where you need to recharge your shields by using certain resources, and you had to go into the menu to do that. There was no quick option to do any of that. I realize that's probably been patched out now, but it shouldn't have launched with that in the first place. Even on console, that would have been a nightmare to go through. And on top of that, the controls on PC were just abysmal. While walking around and using the mouse and keyboard were okay, flying a ship was nigh on impossible. There are game examples out there that use mouse flight. For example, Elite Dangerous and War Thunder have mouse flight in them, and it works just fine. But No Man's Sky seemed to not really be able to do mouse flight at all. And the disappointing part, of course, not being able to fly close to the planet. You had a sort of fixed altitude to go at. You couldn't pitch down, really. That felt really restrictive overall. And, of course, the way the menus worked on PC when you switch between controller and mouse. In fact, I think I said this in the video, where if you were to use a mouse, or even if you use a controller, there are certain points where moving to select certain options would cut off parts of the screen. So if you're in a dialogue with an alien creature, you can sometimes not be able to read the whole message if you move from one side of the menu to the other, which frankly seems like a massive oversight and frankly should not even be happening. But that was the thing that I found about the game that just kind of killed it for me. Is really just the clunkiness of the menus. Now, I like a good UI. I like UIs that work, and I put Transport Fever on my top 5 of the year, even though its UI is a bit unintuitive, to put it lightly. But with No Man's Sky, with the amount of interaction you have with the menus, it has to be a menu that functions, and frankly, all of the clicks you had to go through to get anything done were just far too much and far too difficult. So it might sound like whining if you did enjoy the game, and I'm sorry to anybody who is a fan of No Man's Sky. If you are enjoying the game and you're still enjoying it now, especially after the updates and things, then more power to you, because frankly it wasn't a game that I enjoyed, and this unfortunately is my personal list. So there you have it, No Man's Sky. With or without the misleading marketing, with or without Sean Murray apparently lying in interviews, you separate the company from its game, and even then, the game itself still falls flat on its face to me. Unfortunately, there it is, No Man's Sky, the worst game of 2016. But let me know what you guys think. If you have a different game that you would make your worst game of 2016, or in fact, if you have a worse 5 games of 2016, do let me know what they are down in the comments, and if you want to, feel free to let me know why you've picked the games you have, because of course I always do like to know what different people's opinions are, and of course why they think the way they do. I am very curious about that sort of thing. It's just in my nature. But of course, if you have seen a game on this list that has still caught your eye, even though it might not be fantastic, but you do want to get 20% off on it, do feel free to check Green Man Gaming out down in the description. I've got a referral link down there that you can click, and that will give you a 20% off any game on their store. And yeah, it also helps to support the channel. So thank you all very much for watching. My name is Panzer, and I'll see you next time.